Good afternoon, everybody. And to our guests, welcome to the Urban Institute, and thanks for joining us today. My name is David Pitts. I'm the Interim Associate Vice President for Justice Policy here at Urban, and I'm really excited to be able to welcome all of you to a fantastic panel today. Before I do that, though, I do have some housekeeping items that I want to work through with you briefly. The first item on that list is that the event is being recorded. And so the recording will be posted online afterward on the event page at urban.org. Similarly, if you'd like to learn more about our speakers, you can find information, their full biographies, online as well at urban.org. For accessibility purposes, we have provided ASL translation and closed captioning is enabled for those who are connecting with us remotely. If you are interested in adjusting your caption settings remotely, you can do that using the Show Hide Caption button. So all of the online participants are muted, and so you can type questions and comments into the Q&A box as the event proceeds, and we will save time for Q&A at the end of this session. We ask that you please take a couple of minutes at the conclusion of the event to fill out our survey. And finally, we ask that you engage with us online using #LiveAtUrban. And so with that out of the way, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panel. So as you know, the topic of our conversation today is racial inequalities in the criminal legal system. And the impetus for the conversation is a recent consensus study that you may have seen outside that was issued by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Mathematics, Medicine, sorry, not math, the Committee on Law and Justice. And we are very fortunate to have with us today a couple of the folks that wrote that report. We have María Vélez, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland, as well as Bruce Western, who is the Bryce Professor of Sociology and Social Justice and Director of the Justice Lab at Columbia. Joining Bruce and María on stage will be John Eason, who is the Watson Family University Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at Brown, as well as a Senior Fellow and Equity Scholar here at the Urban Institute. Unfortunately, our original moderator, Kim Leary, had some travel difficulties today, so she sends her apologies for being unable to join us, so I will moderate the conversation in her place. And so with that, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage. All right. So I'd like first to start with some context for the report. And if you all have not had a chance to dive into it yet, it is quite a comprehensive and honestly fantastic treatment of racial inequality in the criminal legal system. So I'd like to start with Bruce. Maybe if you could tell us a little bit about what motivated the committee to undertake the work.
Yeah, thanks, David. And thank you very much for the invitation to this panel and the opportunity to speak to everyone today. I guess the report has a very long history because there's a long tradition of work on racial inequality through National Research Council reports and through the Committee on Law and Justice. And there have been reports on policing and deterrence and criminal careers and incarceration. And race and racial inequality has been an important theme that runs through all these reports that go back at least as far as the 1980s. And but there had never been a report that took on race as its primary focus and looked at the system as a whole and looked at the way different parts of the system interlock together to create large-scale and very enduring racial inequalities. And Ruth Peterson and Jeremy Travis, who are on the Committee on Law and Justice, years ago had tried to organise a report whose sole focus was on racial inequality in the system. And It was very tough to organise. But then, of course, the country was seized by a very acute sense of crisis around the murder of George Floyd and all of the activism that followed over that summer of 2020. And I think that really provided the impetus to fund the report and write a charge that was very broad that took on the topic of racial inequality in the system as a whole. And I think the underlying intuition behind this very broad charge is that the racial inequality that we see in the system is systemically generated, and it's not just generated by the way policing is done, or the way sentencing is done in the courts, or the way the correctional system is operated. This is systemically generated across a whole array of institutions.
Thank you. Yes. So I want to turn to María next, and I think it's important for us all to keep in mind that the inequalities that we're talking about and that we see in the criminal legal system didn't happen overnight, and they didn't happen in a vacuum, right? And so there's a really complicated history of race in the United States that I think lends itself to conversation on this topic. And the report includes an extensive section on this. And so, María, I'm wondering if you might walk us through some of the most important historical drivers of racial inequalities that you've uncovered in that work.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the, I think, defining features of the report is to have a through line throughout the whole document, which is that to really understand contemporary inequalities and crime victimization and legal system outcomes, you have to think about the way that society is organized around race. And so we draw on the principle of structural racism to kind of make that point, right? And that the idea is that rather than thinking about race from like an individual level kind of view where it's based on people's own ideas, animus, bigotry, et cetera, we try to think of how race is an organizing principle that organizes institutions and organizations, right? And so then we use that as the through line to really take into account how we got to the current state, which is another thing that the report does, is really show how much inequality there is in crime victimization and legal system outcomes. And so to give you a sense of that, I just thought I'd talk about two examples because we have a lot in the report. One of them is to think about the coupling of race and systems of punishment, you can look at historically how those two things were tied, that now you can see in current manifestations of thinking about punishment. So, for instance, we point to the idea of for instance, how black codes were instituted during the Civil War, right? Thinking about how punishment and race can be coupled, how you can use systems of law and order to control black bodies. We also talk about other groups, but that's where the research is particularly robust. And then in terms of a more contemporary example of how history has legacies for us to understand contemporary urban America is to think about patterns of residential segregation related to and connected to patterns of investment and disinvestment. What a lot of people talk about is like issues of redlining, for instance, right? And so those historical legacies of investment patterns, some places having more or less money from banks, for instance, in the 1930s, how that shapes over time to create contemporary inequality that we show in the report has potential for understanding why there's differences in crime and victimization across urban spaces, right? And so then part of that through line, and I'm happy to give more examples if we want, but part of that through line, the historical through line, is to really make the point in the report that to understand racial inequality in the criminal legal system and to really making it, like to shape and moderate that, right, make it, lessen it, you have to both address issues related to historical legacies that produce the systems of inequality, and then you also have to address issues within the system, right? So that gives you that window into thinking about that both in and outside the system is how you eradicate the inequality. So happy to elaborate more if you want.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thanks. And so, John, I'd like to ask you next to talk a little bit about data. So the report, and I think a lot of our conversation about criminal legal system issues, focuses on the need for more and better data, Right. I know this is something that's challenged your work as well, and so I'm curious why this is such a challenge in the criminal legal space. So if we think about, for example, like public education, you can access, as a member of the public, data about schools and student outcomes easily. It's all transparent. It's all available online. We do not have that at our disposal in our space. What do you think we need to do, John, to get there? Or I guess if I'm being a little more pessimistic, can we get there?
So in order to get there, I think the major problem we face is the fact that a lot of parts of the criminal legal system, we don't want to admit that we have issues, especially showing racial disparities, because if you show that you have racial disparities, you probably have to do something about it. So that's the first thing. The other part of this is law enforcement is in charge of data collection, and they aren't always the best at and the most accurate at collecting data. So you can see this in how they identify people they're arresting, charging, and everything else. You can see slippage in data all along the way. I rarely use secondary data. I do a lot of original data collection, and there's a high price to be paid for that. Often you have to use FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. There's actually an entire article that was published a few years ago on freedom of information requests. In the process, you have to go through to get data from state, local, and federal agencies, and that can take up to 2 or 3 years. Sometimes they don't respond. Often the data is in really crappy form, to use a very nice word. The amount of time it takes to clean or transcribe or do whatever to get the data in a usable form is often very difficult as well. So you have to have a lot of patience and really want to mine it. And that isn't the best path for most researchers in the academy or even in the NGO world. It takes a huge investment, and it has to be a labor of love. So there's the issue where law enforcement in particular doesn't necessarily want doesn't want data about their institution, which will expose their institution. And then the the cost is very high, and a lot of private funders and government agencies don't want to necessarily fund these types of exploration, because sometimes you may not get answers that are popular, or you may not have enough data to have conclusive evidence on things. So it's a huge expedition to go out and get your own data.
So turning to, I guess, on-the-ground, tangible change. Bruce, I'm curious, because the report talks a little bit about some of the positive reforms we've seen in the past decade or so, including notable decreases in the overall prison population in the United States, as well as decreases in the number of folks that are under community supervision. So I'm wondering if these changes have come alongside reductions in some of the racial disparities that we've seen in the past, and if there are areas where racial disparities seem to persist despite reforms elsewhere.
Yeah, this is a really important question, David. There are some interesting trends in incarceration and policing, I would add as well, that are really important for understanding how we change inequality, reduce inequality in the system, eliminate inequality in the system. And incarceration rates, imprisonment rates specifically, have been declining since 2008. And racial disparity, black-white disparities have been declining since 2008. In fact, black-white disparities in imprisonment have been declining since the 1990s. And the committee looked at those trends, and because part of our charge was to propose recommendations to reduce inequality. And so we were trying to understand what was going on with imprisonment rates, big decline in the scale of imprisonment, big decline in disparity. What lessons can we take from those trends in making our recommendations. And we talked a lot about the difference between relative versus absolute disparities. And so relative disparities is the risk of one group's incarceration compared to another. So the black-white ratio and imprisonment rates at the moment is about 5 to 1. People in black communities are about 5 times more likely to go to prison than people in white communities. Another way to think about disparity is the absolute disparity. How many more people are there in a group that are in prison, for example, compared to another group? What's the difference? African Americans are about 45% of the prison population, and white Americans, it's in the low 30s. And so there's an absolute gap. And there have been some really important policy changes that have reduced the overall scale of imprisonment. California realignment is a really important example. And so a court-ordered decarceration, a third of the state prison population in California, that had a big effect on reducing the absolute disparity in incarceration. So black Americans in California were disproportionately benefited by the decarceration through realignment. Another example is a change in drug policy. So there's been a really profound change in drug policy over the last 20 years, and drug incarceration rates have fallen markedly. And drug offences was always a category of offences because of the kinds of structural racism that Maria described, in which black communities were facing really high rates of incarceration. And with drug policy reform, measures like defelonization and reduction in sentences, both possession and drug distribution. Again, there has been a really big absolute reduction. And I think the committee's position is that reducing the scope, reducing the overall footprint of the system has really, really important effects on reducing absolute disparity. And a lot of our recommendations are exactly about reducing the overall footprint of the system.
So, Maria, I'm curious about something that I think we all see a lot of in the media, which is that a lot of the reforms that we put into place that aim to reduce racial inequalities, bail reform, for example, some argue that they can compromise public safety, right? And so I'm curious from your own work and from the report, are these concerns warranted? Is it possible to reduce racial inequalities and promote public safety at the same time?
Yeah, that was overarching concern that we had while we were writing the report, actually, because we knew that that would be something that people would want to talk about. And so Bruce did a really nice job already of sort of thinking about what happens when you make policies that try to shrink the footprint of the criminal legal system. So reductions in traffic stops, reductions in incarceration, what does that do to public safety, right? And so what we did was we went to the research, and there's been a pretty robust research, body of research from California on realignment that basically looks at, okay, when there's been this move to reduce the footprint of the criminal legal system, largely because of lawsuits and the courts, then what happens to public safety? Do things become more unsafe, or do they not have does it not make a difference at all? And what we find with that research, generally speaking, is that you can reduce you can make a difference in terms of the footprint of the criminal legal system in a variety of ways, and still not has little to no cost for public safety. And so that's a big theme that we think is important in the report. We also review some research related to New York City and a couple of other places where we review the research on that. So the committee kind of comes down on it. It's a false dichotomy, right? You can achieve racial equality or move towards racial equality and still not have any kind of cost to public safety. But we do caution and I just want to reiterate what Bruce just mentioned, that there's a difference between absolute and relative, right? So you can make the absolute levels of connections to the criminal legal system go down for particular groups, Blacks and Latinos, for instance, but it's still relatively, they still experience much greater contact with those systems. So I don't know if you'd add anything to that, Bruce.
No, that's right on.
Okay. Hey.
So I want to continue for a moment, though, on this idea of potential trade-offs. And so I'm going to turn to John next. And if we think about the relationship between race and the criminal legal system, it's actually complicated in that the system also employs thousands of employees of color, right? And so when we try to limit the footprint of the system through decarceration, sentencing reform, we're often taking jobs away from communities that need the work. And so, John, I'm curious, in your own work, how have you found us able to promote reform that reduces inequality without those sorts of negative externalities attached to it?
So much of the discussion around decarceration and prison reform itself is centered on what I'd say is the supply side, the flow of bodies into facilities, right, through the complicated courts and policing apparatus, different ways that people end up in a cage. What we don't often think about is where those cages are built and who tends them. So in 2019, there were over 450,000 corrections officers. About 33% of them were Black. Another 11 or 12% are Latino. There's a recent study by Dan Martinez at the University of Arizona looking at Border Patrol. Half of Border Patrol are Mexicans, so Mexican Americans. So the way that these jobs have also affected certain communities, you have communities of color that disproportionately, rural communities of color that disproportionately build prisons. So between policing, corrections officers, and the like, we are people of color are vastly overrepresented on that side of the equation too. Actually, I'm still working through the math on this, but while 8 out of 10 African Americans are likely to know someone who's ever been incarcerated, we're at least as likely to know someone who's employed across the criminal legal system. And these people think these aren't good jobs, and these are often jobs that provide an on-ramp to the middle class for a lot of Black and Latino folks. So this complicates what we need to do, especially given the fact that the prison boom, the buildup of over 1,000 prisons, was mainly in rural communities and mainly communities that had larger percentages of Black and Latino residents. So we have to come up with with alternative strategies for development in these communities so that we can disincentivize their hold, or the hold that the prison has on them. If we want to reduce the footprint of the criminal legal system, we also have to look at the demand side. We have to look at where prisons are being built, where immigrant detention centers are being built, and offer those communities, prioritize incentives for those communities to get other development, right? So I can talk about that more in Q&A, but yeah.
Great. Thanks, John. So Bruce, I'm curious about one of the recommendations issued in the report, which is that we need research that moves beyond, as the report put it, a black-white paradigm. So how do you think this paradigm has held us back from understanding racial inequality, and what is it that we need to do in order to move past it?
Yeah. This is something we really wrestled with, and one short answer to the question is right from the very beginning of our deliberations, which was back in 2020 now. Everyone on the committee was seized with the importance of the way police, the courts, incarceration was operating in Native communities. And we felt that that had largely been overlooked in most of research and most of the policy process as well. So we did what we could to learn more about Indigenous incarceration, policing, and policing on Indian country, and so on. I think that intuition on the part of the committee, there was something behind it, and I think we were driven by a broader interest in the way in which race influences larger projects of criminalisation and punishment, and the limitation, the main limitation, I think, of being sort of locked into a black-white binary where you're not really analysing the experience of Native communities, or you're not really analysing the experience in Latino communities, is that inequality is underestimated, right? You're underestimating how much inequality in the system there really is. This group that we're calling white is really a very heterogeneous group of people that operationally in research often includes Native American people and Latino people and so on, who also face elevated risks of police contact, arrest, and incarceration. And so I think that was sort of how we made an effort. I'm not sure we were fully successful, but that's what our effort looked like, to go beyond the black-white binary. Our conceptual motivation was to paint a more complete picture of inequality that didn't underestimate inequality, and I think to move us towards recommendations that would get us beyond racialized projects of criminalization and punishment in which race was not a factor in contact with the system. And in order to do all of those things, we had to get beyond the black-white binary, I think.
So keeping with this idea of complicating the idea of race, Maria, I'll turn to you next. We know that race often intersects with other dimensions of identity. So for example, in our space, we often talk a lot about black men and their experiences in the system more than we talk about black women. We often talk a lot about how poverty also plays a role that intersects with race. And so I'm curious, Maria, what are some of the intersections that we need to be thinking about, and where do you think researchers ought to be focusing their energies in this space?
Yeah, great question. I mean, again, something we talked a lot about in the report, you know, how do we make sense of this concept that's related to race, but it's a social construction, it's historically linked, right? It's regional, there are just different histories, immigration, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of things there that feed into how these statuses, for lack of a better word, kind of play themselves out. So I think in the report, what we try to do just in general is conceptually, we think that's where we should go, that really thinking about within group differences, right? Because with intersectionality, you can look at what's going on within a particular group, and you can break it down by gender, you can break it down by income levels, right? So you can see within Black, within Latino, right, as a way of getting at intersectionality. But then intersectionality also means a variety of comparisons, right? Race, class, and gender, looking at how Black men experience things versus Latino men, et cetera, right? So there's just different ways to think about it. So we applaud any move in that direction, I think, in the report, where we really, and we review research to the, wherever we could, we went to the intersectional approach when we reviewed the research, right? So let's say we have a lot of discussion on the moving to opportunity research. And, so what does it mean for someone to have had the option, to move to a different neighborhood, and what are the outcomes related to delinquency, et cetera, right? The moving to opportunities studies are highlighted in the report. But as an example, the way the moving to opportunity plays out depends on gender. And so wherever we could, we try to discuss that, I guess is that would be the first thing I would say. But then we were really hindered by data. So as John and Bruce have already said, we're really limited with what we know about how intersectionality plays both into the system and then also how the system then interacts with different intersections of people, right? So we saw it as sort of that's how you enter into the system in terms of crime victimization potentially, and then also how the system interacts with you is also intersectional in its approach. So it's a little academic in that regard, but in terms of data infrastructure, we're just not there. And so those are some major recommendations that we have at the end of the report, that we need better data to investigate those things.
So thinking about how race is not always just about race, criminal legal system involvement also is not just about an arrest or an incarceration. All sorts of negative outcomes accrue to people who have system involvement, among them a host of negative health consequences. And John, I know you've looked at a good bit of this in your own research, so I'm curious about the relationship between system impact and health, and how that relationship can influence broader trends in neighborhoods and communities.
I did want to just say one thing about moving beyond the black-white binary before I go into this.
Sure.
If we move beyond the black-white binary, we'd actually know that we could we'd be able to understand that the most racist portion, arguably the most racist portion of the criminal legal system, is almost outside of the criminal legal system. It's the immigrant detention center system, with over 90% of the inhabitants being Latino, right? And primarily from 4 countries. So if you understand that, and you understand, and I use the term cage loosely, if you understand how these cages operate, not only for the people who are held in them, but also people who are minding them. We have a lot of health. The research has shown for years that HIV, AIDS, almost 20% of all HIV AIDS cases can be traced back into our prison system. We have a lot of other communicable diseases that can be traced back into prison. I have research I've been looking at the UW-Madison Cancer Center, looking at health outcomes and treatment for people in prison and out of prison. And prison does not help folks with cancer. Just imagine that. It's not really good for people with cancer. It's not a good place for that. And then with the pandemic, right? Prisons there's several projects that showed this. The COVID Behind Bars Prison Pandemic Project, and some research I've done as well with NSF, looking at the relationship between incarceration and the spread of COVID. And guards, the correctional staff, actually help propagate this. And because they're disproportionately people of color, and they go back into communities of color, even before the people who were moving in and out of prison or in and out of jail, the staff were just as important as propagating it into communities of color. So the health outcomes, this is really good money after bad. Anyone that tries to argue for increased public safety, for example, if we're defining public safety in a very narrow way, it becomes problematic. If we're thinking about public safety on a much broader scale, thinking about public health, right? And the fact that we had so many people die in immigrant detention facilities, jails, and prisons, as well as the spread, these facilities being an engine for spreading COVID. That's in other communicable diseases. This is the need to reduce the footprint of the system and racial inequalities. If there's anything that screams the need for that, is the health outcomes.
Thanks, John. So we have time for 2 to 3 more questions before we move to audience Q&A, but I'll remind those of you in the room that if you'd like to submit a question, you can do that using the QR codes on your table, so please make use of those if you'd like. Moving back to Bruce, actually, we've talked a lot over the course of the conversation today about racial inequalities in policing, in sentencing, and incarceration, system involvement, but we don't really focus as much, I think, in our conversation generally on trends in victimization. So what do we know about racial disparities among those who are victims of crime?
Yeah, victimization was a big focus of the report, and part of our charge, part of the racial inequality we're asked to consider. So I think racial disparities in imprisonment now about 4 or 5 to 1. Racial disparities in homicide victimization are about 6 or 7 to 1 at the moment. And black-white disparities. The big increase in homicides and shootings that we saw in 2020 that was sustained into 2021 was concentrated almost entirely in black communities. And this is an enormous question. There are a lot of ways to respond. I'll pick up just one thread in the very complicated conversation our committee had about this question. I think, Maria put her finger right on this. So as we think about measures to reduce inequality in the system, to reduce racial disparities in incarceration or police contact or police use of force, which we haven't talked about yet this afternoon. We should be thinking at the same time about measures that will also reduce risks of victimization, disparities in victimization. So we should think about justice strategies as going hand in hand with safety strategies. And I think in our political conversation right now, the justice goals are somehow standing in opposition to the goals of community safety. But in the view of the committee, more justice should mean safer communities. And I think you see this reflected in our recommendations, where we have a lot of discussion of things that can be done outside of the system. So safety net programs are really important for reducing victimization, and they're important for reducing system contact. There's really good research now around Medicaid expansion. There's a bunch of good papers now around Medicaid expansion showing the value of Medicaid expansion in reducing victimization rates and arrest rates, and these disproportionately benefit communities of colour. In the report, we talk a lot about CVI programs and the importance of community-led initiatives to empower communities to be the author of their own safety. And I think those two recommendations around safety net programs and CVI were exactly motivated by an approach in which we saw reductions in victimization, reductions in disparate contact as going hand in hand as part of a safety and justice strategy.
Great. Yeah, I want to stick with the idea of the role of communities for a moment, Maria, and I'll turn to you next. So the report talks extensively about the role of communities in promoting safety. And so, Maria, how would greater community involvement reduce the racial inequality that we see in this system? Are there promising practices that we should think about working to diffuse more broadly?
Yeah, the way we think about community, I mean, obviously it's a complicated concept. And so we try to think about community as it can also be within a heterogeneous context, but we draw heavily on social disorganization theory, those of you who might find that familiar, or the idea of collective efficacy, which is that communities are a repository for a lot of resiliency. And so these are the communities provide, in many ways, the answers to counteract some of the deleterious conditions related to racial exclusion, historical legacies, marginalization, et cetera, right? And so if you think about community as being built up in that way, it has a lot of promise for addressing these social harms. And so we think of community-oriented safety as being led by the community. And so we talk about sort of the potential for a community to do those kinds of things. In terms of examples, I wanted to bring back the idea with community violence interruption. We reviewed research on community violence interruptions, groups that might do credible messengers. So we have, within the report, we have little boxes that kind of highlight particular organizations that are doing this kind of work that are grassroots trying to address issues related to violence. But what makes them so impactful is that they're using people from the community to send the message of how to sort of dissipate, mitigate the potential for violence. And so we saw potential for a lot of community violence interruption in terms of potentially helping eradicate violence and then addressing issues related to racial inequality. So that's one suggestion that we have actually in the report. And then also we see the community in terms of accountability, that the community can play a role in making sure that data systems are accountable, that programmatic implementations related to racial inequality, that the community makes the people who are doing those policy innovations potentially accountable, right? So we saw the community as really holding a lot of promise in terms of addressing some of these issues that are plaguing some communities more than others. I think those were some of the main points that I would make there. I don't know if you want to add anything, Bruce or John.
Yeah, I think that part of the report really, by focusing on credible messengers, I think that is a way that we're moving forward. But community, broadly speaking, the report also points to the need to move beyond urban.
Yeah,
we have a black-white binary. We also have a strong urban, and I'd say even regional, northern urban bias, right? So we think of a lot of our models for how we understand neighborhood effects are based on Chicago, and as a native Chicagoan, I actually had to leave Chicago during grad school because I was tired of hearing everything being about Chicago, right? So rural communities and suburban communities as well. Jessica Symes, another one of Bruce's students, has a great book called Punishing Places, where she looks at crime and punishment across suburban and rural communities, and understanding how place and how neighborhood effects matters not just in urban centers but across different places. So yeah, I think the need for better data and new paradigms, I think, go hand in hand.
And can I just, John just got me thinking about, we also have a whole section in the report about place-based, thinking about communities, but that also means places, right? Mm-hmm. And so thinking about investments in places. So we review the research on, for instance, community block grants, getting resources, or cities giving resources to community organizations to stimulate community social organization. That also helps reduce crime, and then thinking about eradicating the physical decline that many communities experience. There's a lot of potential for the greening of places and helping reduce violence there. So thinking about place-based investments, we thought was a really helpful way of thinking about policy innovations.
Great, thank you. And I'm looking, we have really fantastic questions from the audience. So I think I'm going to pivot to that next, if that's okay. And I'm going to start with a question that says, a lot of energy has gone into dissolving the false dichotomy between, quote, violent and, quote, nonviolent offenses. Can the panel speak to why it's important to reject that narrative and end exclusions, leaving people labeled violent and serious behind? And I'll just open it to whomever is in a position to respond.
I mean, I could take a stab quickly to kick us off. This wasn't a key focus of the NAS report, but clearly it's been important both for the increase in incarceration through 2008, and I would say for the reduction in incarceration as well, and of violence carries enormous symbolic weight in the political conversation, and it elicits a deeply punitive response. And I think the political subtext of the drug war, when drug incarceration rates were going through the roof in the 90s in particular, and into the early 2000s, the subtext of the conversation about the drug war was one of violence, particularly in very poor communities of colour, and that's where we saw sort of enhancements and truth in sentencing and length of stay in prison increased, and particularly among violent offences, and that was a big driver of the increase in incarceration rate. And there's a lot of work going on there, demonising black men in particular as a dangerous group, in which the full weight of the state came down on like a ton of bricks. I say the salience of violence is also interesting in the recent period when incarceration has been declining, and I think it's really, really important that we look at episodes when the system is contracting and try and take policy lessons from those experiences. And because I think the conversation, the national conversation about drugs in this country is really changed quite profoundly, and drug incarceration rates has come down. I think partly in the context of the opioid epidemic, which is disproportionately affecting white communities to black communities. There's greater space in the political conversation to talk about public health approaches, although I tend to think our public policy response to drugs is still extremely punitive. We shouldn't underestimate that. But the symbolic centre of gravity of the political conversation has shifted around drugs, and the spectre of violence, the fear-mongering around black criminality has changed from what it was in the 1990s, and we've seen a reduction in incarceration rates as a result. Very long-winded, sorry.
No, that's great. That's fantastic. Thank you. I think I will move on to another question, though, that I'll pose to the other panelists, if that's okay. And there's one sort of based in the historical context I think is interesting, which is that some observers are arguing that the rise of mass incarceration in the 1970s was a function of a desire to impose social controls primarily on black communities following the gains of the civil rights movement. Others contend that these developments followed socioeconomic changes that disadvantaged black communities. So how do you view these competing arguments as to sort of causal factors?
I mean, is the question of really, I mean, is it the sort of differential offending versus differential treatment? That's what it sounds like a little bit, right? That is it. What led to the rise in mass incarceration? Was it more offending, or was it more a system responding in terms of a backlash against the civil rights movement? Right?
I hear it as political backlash versus sort of deindustrialization, creating a whole variety of social problems, including crime, but including, why not both?
Yeah,
I mean, I think both of those things happen.
That's what the report says too.
But I think it's both and more. I mean, my work shows that, this is the work I'm developing here at Urban, that the biggest boom, the biggest increase in incarceration across states, right, was predated by prison building. So it wasn't the other way, like we were overcrowded and we weren't overcrowded and then we built prisons to match that. In fact, we're one of the most undercrowded systems when you compare us internationally. We're number one or near the top still in rate of incarceration. We're like 123 right now for occupancy, right? So starting in the mid 80s and 90s is when we built out a whole bunch of prisons, right? And that, I think, in addition to everything we've already said, I think this is a huge missing factor that we haven't really considered, that we built our way into mass incarceration, right? States who built more prisons, their incarceration rate followed the number of prisons they built.
And I think I would add, I mean, Bruce, you were on the National Academies incarceration report, so you know more than I do. But I mean, the idea that it's one or the other, it's like that. I think we try to propose it's a dynamic, and that of course race and a backlash could be happening while also deindustrialization is shaping urban inequality, as an example, in a way that's going to create the conditions that might lead to higher levels of violence, right? So I think the report would want you to think about those as coupled potentially, and that thinking about what happens in the system, not thinking about what's going on outside the system also is a misguided approach, right? That we'd want to think about both of those, and then of course adding on to some other dynamics. Though, I mean, what the incarceration report says is that the policy decisions that we made about longer sentences, for instance, those were very impactful as well, to leading to the rise of incarceration. I don't know if that is that.
That's great. That's
I don't know who asked the question, but
it's a good question.
It's a good question, yeah.
So I'm going to ask one more question. I'd like all of you to respond fairly briefly if you can, which is that we had a comment that from the audience that there's a lot in this report. It's a fantastic report. What was left on the cutting room floor, or alternatively, where do you want scholars, policymakers, and practitioners to build on this work, maybe most importantly?
Everything I've already said, so I'll let them talk. I cede my time. Everything I've already said is where I'd like us to build.
You know, it's a good question when they wait a minute to respond. Yeah.
It's a great question. What would you say?
Well, I mean, it was a very exhaustive attempt to try to provide a State of the Union on what do we know, because we wanted people to be able to go to one place and get a really good answer on how should we think about racial inequality in the criminal legal system. I think where I would want to see us move towards is when we have conversations about the rise in violence that we might see, 2014 to 2015, let's say 2018 to 2020, that we don't think about homicide risk as being elevated and not think about the historical context, not structurally connecting those patterns. That would be something that I hope that people will take from the report and really use it to give that kind of evidence that these things are linked. And then I guess the other thing that I would say, and then I'll leave it to Bruce to close it out, is that we need the infrastructure to really understand the various ways, as John was saying, about how racial inequality is playing out in the criminal legal system, we did what we could. We tried to uncover it in any way we could, but there's still a lot to understand. And so there's just limited data to try to track things over time, for instance, within one person's life, as an example.
Yeah,
Bruce?
yeah. I think two things. So the report drew on a tremendous body of research. But sometimes I wonder whether we're doing research that really fires our political imagination, right? And gets us thinking big about what change could be in a research-based way. This isn't some sort of pie-in-the-sky utopian thinking. We can point to other examples in the world that make us think about alternatives in a very ambitious way. So I think one thing we didn't touch, which would have been very interesting to dig into, would be comparative research. What's happening in other countries? Not so much what do prisons and policing look like in other countries. We in this room, I think, know something about that, but what does the safety net look like? What do schools look like? What is a person's sense of opportunity? What do their neighbourhood environments look like? So that's one direction I'd offer. The other thing, similarly sort of motivated to try and get us thinking more ambitiously about what we can do politically and in policy, is, what harms are we really concerned with? What are the harms that people cause to other people, and how do we respond to those? And we spend a lot of time with homicide, and the social costs of homicide are dramatic and tragic and horrible, and one of the most awful parts of racial inequality in this system. In 2008, before the global financial crisis, there was an absolute crime wave unfolding on Wall Street, and there were no criminal prosecutions addressing what happened then, and the harms from that activity were devastating, and are devastating for people who were the most disadvantaged. Maybe that should be part of our conversation about crime and inequality as well, right? So I throw out those two ideas as a way to try and fire our imaginations a bit in a research-based way.
Excellent, thank you. John, did you have another quick comment?
I had a little snide comment. When I teach crim, the Intro to Crim course, I would always talk about how we need to go after white-collar criminals, right? If you want to see if you want to reduce racial disparities, we need to go after white-collar criminals because they're disproportionately white. So, yeah, thanks for that.
So we do have a reception outside for those of you who are here in person, so we hope that you'll be able to stick around for a moment and visit with us. But let me thank all of you for coming, both here and online. I want to thank the panelists for a really fantastic conversation. And then quickly, I want to thank the National Academies, Raven Group, Urban Events team, Bess Cohen and Alice Galley for exceptional coordination. So thank you all. We appreciate your being with us today.
Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it.